We are blind to our blindness. We have very little idea of how little we know. We are not designed to know how little we know. Daniel Kahneman. Hi, I'm Matt Kutz, host of the Contextual Intelligence Podcast and author of Contextual Intelligence, How 3D Thinking Can Help Resolve Complexity, Uncertainty, and Ambiguity. And welcome to episode 13 of the Contextual Intelligence Podcast. In this episode, we're discussing chapter 12 of my award-winning book on contextual intelligence. In this episode, we're talking about the disruptors of 3D thinking. In previous episodes, we talked about 3D thinking, hindsight, insight, foresight. We talked about the Christmas ghosts and how each of us needs to be our own Christmas ghost so that we can revisit accurately the past, so we can understand what's happening in the present, and that so we can properly anticipate the future. So we need visits in Ebenezer Scrooge style from the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future. And we need to learn to be our own Christmas ghosts and practice 3D thinking. When our hindsight and our foresight converge together accurately, then we actually can operate in a level of insight that is unavailable to us otherwise. So we've talked about that before, and in this chapter, we look into and delve deep into specific disruptors of 3D thinking, or we identify certain fallacies or thinking heuristics that get us in trouble and prevent us from actually thinking in 3D. The failure to accurately diagnose the current context can lead to mistakes that have detrimental effects on us and our organizations. And we have to be intentional about not making those mistakes. And it's not just a luck thing, or I hope I don't make these mistakes. There's actual things that we can do to prevent those mistakes, and things we should be looking out for and watching for that tend to exaggerate those mistakes. And that's what we talk about in this chapter. So regardless of the reasons, our lack of awareness about the obstacles preventing us from accurately diagnosing our context is an underlying cause. So we've got to improve our awareness, and we've got to be mindful of how we think, the process we use in decision making and thinking, and then the assumptions we're making. And that's really the big message of this particular chapter, and a big part of 3D thinking in general is learning how to understand the environment around us through the lens of our own thinking processes. And so often and so many times we make mistakes and we fail to make good decisions or better decisions because we're not aware that how we see our environment is dramatically affected by the mindset we bring to it and by the processes that we use. So a big part of thinking in 3D is just learning about our own thinking process, our own heuristics, as it were. And heuristics is basically the rules of thumb that we use to live by. It's the assumptions that we have about how life is and how the world works and how we work, so to speak. And we want to be aware of those things instead of just taking them for granted. It's very similar to the notion of a worldview or a paradigm. Decades ago, a very popular book by Thomas Kuhn called The Structure of Scientific Revolution, where he really popularized the term paradigm. And what's interesting about that book is how often people are unaware of their paradigm. You know, the old analogy or the old metaphor that the fish doesn't know it's in water, until you take the fish out of the water. And the same thing's true with our own paradigm. So often we're not even aware of the rule book that we live by, the assumptions we make about life, the processes that we use, the rules of thumb, so to speak, until someone violates that, until someone challenges that. And the effective 3D thinker actually is very intentional about understanding how they think, why they think, where their values came from, where their beliefs came from, where their assumptions came from, and how they have been formed and how they continue to be formed by the experiences that we seek, by the things we choose to remember, and how we even process and categorize those things we choose to remember. So that's a big part of working well with the 3D thinking model and framework. And part of this conversation relates to a very important concept that was popularized again by the opening quote from Daniel Kahneman. Him and Amos Tversky actually wrote quite a bit on the notion of logical fallacies and cognitive biases, and he really popularized the whole idea behind the heuristics we use to make the decisions that we do and how we categorize and use memories, etc. And if we fail to fully practice the meta skill of 3D thinking, it's because we often succumb to logical fallacies and the common logical fallacies. And in this chapter, we talk about a few of those, and there's many, of course, that we can learn about, many that have an impact on our thinking. So I'm only going to highlight a few and then encourage you to get the book to uncover some other ones. But one of the big ones is hindsight bias. Hindsight bias is particularly detrimental to 3D thinking because it creates a major obstacle to understanding the past. See, the past is never useless. However, if not interpreted correctly, it can be extremely problematic. The problem with hindsight bias is that it blinds us to the truth of the past. It is a means by which we protect ourselves from the vicious memories and embarrassing moments that once were. So hindsight bias is kind of a protective mechanism that we use to prevent those things, those embarrassing moments, those memories. And what it is we reimagine what actually happened. And I like to say it this way, is the epitome of hindsight bias is when we place ourselves as the central character in every memory that we have. And every time we go back to that videotape file in our minds and our brains to rehash what happened, we always place ourselves as the central hero or heroine, right? We always place ourselves as the main character in that memory. And then we always see things through the lens of our own perspective, how things affected me, what I said, how the outcome reflected on my reputation or whatever, instead of understanding the event from another person's perspective. And I think the way we can do that effectively is just do the mind hack of remembering something, but not placing yourself as the central character in that memory, placing someone else as a central character in that memory. And the other thing that we do with hindsight bias is we tend to misremember everything in our favor. And every time we go back and remember something, think of it as something in a bucket. Think of all kinds of things. And over the course of time, you throw experience after experience, memory after memory, event after event, situation after situation into a bucket. And every time you go back into that bucket and reach down into that bucket and grab out a memory and pull it out, you have to drag it through all the other experiences that have accumulated over time. And every time you pull out an older memory, you filter it through those new, more recent experiences. So every time you pull it out, it's different than what originally happened. That's what hindsight bias is. And every time we remember it, we are now seeing it through a different lens, a lens of new experiences, a lens of different opportunities, successes, failures, relationships that have come and gone over the years or weeks, maybe even moments. But every time we go back into that bucket to pull out a memory, it's different every time we pull it out. That's hindsight bias. And we need to understand first that we do that. It's just human nature. Every time we remember something, it's never the same as when it originally happened. And even it's different from the last time we remembered it. And we're not even aware that this is happening, but it just does, and it is. So the best way to overcome hindsight bias, and I don't know that you can truly, actually ever completely overcome hindsight bias. So this is more of a way to mitigate and manage hindsight bias, but the best way to do that is to make sure you have multiple inputs. In other words, you need to have other people help you remember what actually happened, because if left to yourself, you can never actually actually remember 100% accurately what happened. Overcoming hindsight bias becomes a critical thing because the more hindsight bias that's built up, the more false history we're making decisions on, the more skewed memories we're using to make decisions. And we just can't afford to do that when things are changing as quickly as they do. And we can't afford to do that with the speed and agility that's typically required in the decisions that we need. Now, this doesn't mean you have to go slow. It just means you need to slow down. And I think this is important because we want to make sure that when we make decisions, hindsight bias doesn't trigger a reflexive, instinctual, quick reaction or use a quick heuristic, because that heuristic is generally going to be based on faulty data. So we don't need to necessarily take weeks and weeks or hours and hours or months and months or whatever to make a decision, but we do need to slow down enough to make sure that the data that we're pulling from is accurate and that we have people in our lives who can help us accurately reflect on and accurately remember what actually happened. That's really, really important. And not wrestling with and dealing with and recognizing the meaning and significance of this hindsight bias fallacy that really has a dramatic impact on how we make decisions is a major, major error that we need to overcome. Everyone demonstrates a certain degree of hindsight bias. It's a no-brainer. It's one of these non-negotiable things. If you are a human being and operate like the rest of the human race operates and uses their brain in the way that everybody else uses their brain, you are a victim of hindsight bias. There is no immunity that you can do to prevent it from happening. So the best thing we can do is be aware that it is happening so that we can mitigate it as best we can. The two ways to do that, one I already mentioned, is have other people involved in the recollection process. What lessons did you learn? How did you learn them? What actually happened? What did they take away from a similar or the same kind of event or lesson? The second thing you can do is learn to journal well and then revisit those journals to put yourself back in the proper context and proper place. You need to have a ghost of Christmas past. That ghost of Christmas past can be the form of other people helping you remember and a journal that you kept in real time at that moment. So those are things that we can do. A couple of things I recommend in the book for helping you manage your hindsight bias is understanding that you're not the central character in every memory you have. We talked about that. The second thing you can do is understand that you are not the hero or victim that you think you are. That's critical. And then the third thing I recommend is understanding that other people are also practicing hindsight bias. So when they recall something and they say something or they show up with a certain sense of certainty about a particular decision or opportunity or threat or whatever it might be, understand that their perception is also being biased by hindsight bias, being filtered and slanted by that. And that's why it's so important we always get a second opinion and ask another person and do our due diligence in slowing down how quickly we pull the trigger. The next thing we talk about in this chapter about different heuristics and logical fallacies that really disrupt 3D thinking is conjunction bias. This is one that was popularized by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, where they particularly talk about how we want to make use of all the information that we have available. I believe, and don't quote me on this directly, but I believe they called it the and fallacy. And this is the idea that the more information that we have about a particular event, person, or whatever, the more likely we are to want to use that information, even if it's completely irrelevant. So the conjunction fallacy really affects how we determine probabilities and how we think something is more or less likely to happen based on what we know. See, as humans, one of the things we want to do is we want to make use of all the information that we've learned about something or that we've accumulated over the course of time because we want to be efficient, right? We want to be wise, and we attribute efficiency and wisdom with using the information that we've noted or observed over time or in the recent past. So when we notice someone's mannerisms, or we notice someone's maybe a little bit discouraged or a little bit excited or happy or whatever, we tend to want to attribute that to something that we think we've observed or know. So for example, let's say we notice a colleague at work who's a little more discouraged than maybe normal, or somebody who's normally happy-go-lucky and always has a good attitude and has high energy. Perhaps we notice that they're a little down. Most of the time, before we ask them about why they might be a little discouraged or they might be a little down, we make an assumption as to why we think that is based on other things we think we've observed. So let's say 4 or 5 days ago, I remember overhearing a conversation in the hallway talking about really high financial strain that the department is under right now. And we know that one particular person in our department happened to have made a recording error in their documentation about that time as well. So we have those two pieces of information working in our brain. And then we walk into the office one day and we see a colleague feeling down. And before we actually ask them what happened, is there anything I can do, do the normal nice thing that hopefully you would do, we make a quick assumption. Oh, I wonder if they're feeling down because they just made that big mistake last week, and I happen to know we're under financial strain right now, and there's a few layoffs going on, and maybe they're on the chopping block. And we just make that general assumption, and then we go ask, hey, is everything okay? I want to make, and then we find out something else that we didn't even know existed. Like, oh, their young child is sick at home today and they couldn't get a sitter this morning. And so they had to do some last minute shuffling, and people had to call in and change schedules and things to accommodate something. And it was just weighing on their mind, kind of a thing. And that's the conjunction bias, when we tend to have to use information that we know to inform the context of a situation before we just actually ask what happened. There's a book out there called Clear Leadership by Gervais Bush, who mentions this in a different kind of way. He uses the term interpersonal mush. And I'm really a fan of that concept of interpersonal mush, because what he's explaining by that concept is how likely we are to create context and stories around something we observe that are completely fallacious, that are completely based on fallacy and fiction, because we're afraid to actually ask what happened, because we don't want to expose ourselves as being naive or ignorant, and because we want to think we're smarter than we are. So we want to use the pieces of information that we have to construct this narrative about what we think we're observing. And we can get by all of that just by actually asking the person with genuine authenticity, what happened? How are you doing? But we don't like to do that first. That's usually a default or a backup when we've realized that our assessment was off. So all of that is conjunction bias. And in my opinion, while hindsight bias is the thing that might be the most frequent, it's conjunction bias that I think is the most damaging to the decisions that we make and most damaging to the actual practice of 3D thinking. So with that, I'm going to kind of draw this podcast to an end. There's other logical fallacies that I talk about in this chapter that I think are really important. The confirmation bias is one thing. I introduced the notion of the agreement trust matrix, which is absolutely an essential thing to learn. And when we think about and talk about how important it is that we have certain people in our lives, who those people are and the position those people hold is absolutely critical to our effectiveness. So when we talk about inviting Christmas ghosts into your world, we need to make sure that those Christmas ghosts meet certain parameters, certain guidelines. We don't just willy-nilly ask anybody anywhere. We have to ask certain people. So who those people are is important, and that's where the agreement trust matrix really comes into play. How much we agree with a person and how much we trust a person is important, because that agreement trust matrix gives us a different positioning of people. So for example, and I'm not going to get too much into this more than just this, but people who we have a high degree of trust with and a high degree of agreement with, we would call them allies or friends. And because of that, our allies and friends, we trust them and we agree with them. They're going to give us a certain slant, a certain perspective on what we see. Most of the time when we ask people what really just did happen and we invite them to be a Christmas ghost for us, they're going to tell us what we already think, which is the confirmation bias. So we need to invite people into this scenario who we might trust but don't necessarily agree with. So again, I'm not going to get into the agreement trust matrix more than that, but it really is an important part of overcoming the disruptors to 3D thinking. So I hope you get a chance to get your hands on the book. And chapter 12 in particular offers some very practical advice and some practical input on how to overcome the things that hinder you from practicing 3D thinking well. So again, the title of the book is Contextual Intelligence, How Thinking in 3D Can Help Resolve Complexity, Uncertainty, and Ambiguity. I'm the author, Matthew Kutz, and I hope to get this book in your hands. Reach out to me. I'd love to talk to you about it. I'll put all my information in the show notes, and I hope to see you. And I'm wishing you a very prosperous and very blessed 2024.